So, Martin, please.
Now, you yourself stated in your presentation that the laws lag way behind the technologies, and we're moving ahead so rapidly. The ramifications of these are astounding, but also have great hope as well as some very dire disaster possible consequences. I made a brief note. What's the future of work? How would wars be managed? What about the human economy? If decisions are not made in the near future about how this is managed, it could be a dystopia.
You bring up excellent points, and these are all challenges to deal with, and I can't give you a glib, simple answer for it. I am an optimist. I do believe that technology in general, people tend to figure out ways to use it for good and prevent bad, but there are a lot of changes going on. I mean, we can go back to the caveman days, and there were probably, Oog and Og, and Oog says, look at this, it's fire, and Og says, oh, I don't know, someone's going to get burned. And people did get burned. Fire isn't uniformly good. So technology itself is neutral, and we have to think about how we use it, and we have to think about how our society needs to shift. A lot of people are thinking that we may see significant changes in the governance of our global society. The notion of nation states with rigid borders that are completely controlled is already clearly being called into question right now in the eastern Ukraine. Who's in charge? Some people would say, well, nobody's really shooting actively, so that's not a war. I say, no, that's a form of 21st century warfare that so far has claimed only a handful of lives relative to what we think of war as traditionally doing. And what does this mean? Part of the challenge, there is a technology called MaidSafe, which basically distributes both applications and data across thousands or millions of computers around the world, and yet only the people with the authorization to access those applications or data can pull all of that together to process it. What it means is there's no single attack point, which also means no single sovereign government can impose controls on people who are utilizing systems like this type. That's MaidSafe. And we're going to see a lot of changes in how this stuff works. And you're right, it's not just about can our legislatures keep up with what kinds of rules we have to use. In some cases, people are simply going to move ahead with what makes economic sense to them or what forwards their goals and objectives in ways that work around the existing processes and systems. And I think part of the reason we've got companies, for example, like Safely Locked, is to give people better approaches and tools to help protect their data when the traditional approaches that served us not that well, but better than anything else that was available for 20 or 30 years, begin to break down under the attacks. So you bring up some excellent points, and these are things we all need to be thinking about and talking about. But we also need to keep in mind that the old-fashioned kind of approach to this, which is let's not do anything until we figure out how we're going to manage it and control it, is never going to work. No, we've got it. You're exactly right.
It's never been that way in the past. Why should it be so now?
Well, right, except in the past things moved slowly enough up until the last half century that there were ways to respond. And in some cases, when they didn't, the systems broke down and we ended up with wars or various different dystopian outcomes, starvation, plagues, that sort of thing. And we have to hope that we can reduce the likelihood of those things. Very stimulating question to ask. Patrick.
You threw up some statistics, and I know where you got them. And they've been updated. And in fact, I just read an update today and it said that the cost of a data breach actually went up 9% since those statistics were printed in that Ponemon Institute. And the average cost is still around 5.4 million, but the average cost per record has gone from $188 to $202.
That doesn't include government fines.
Yeah,
That does not include the 1.5 million per.
Yeah, if you're
received a certain.
Yeah.
Yeah, that just includes the post-event cleanup. So the cost to notify every person whose record was compromised that they were compromised, the cost to do the forensics, the cost to provide credit monitoring for you for 6 months or 9 months or a year, whatever it is. And then that also doesn't cost any litigation. It doesn't involve any litigation, which You know, if you think about last year, Emory University lost 250,000 patient records. They're currently fighting a $200 million lawsuit as a result of that. So the litigation can also, Global Payments, I heard a comment from a senior executive of Global Payments that said it was over $90 million they had spent to date based on the breach they suffered in January 2012. So I think about what's going on, I think about the growth, and then I think about that drone, that intelligent drone that can fight a war. I think we had a movie about that recently. Several movies.
Yeah.
The one
Stealth was one of them, yes.
with, that person that married Jessica Timberlake. But what happens when somebody hacks a drone and then creates an event in North America, hacks a drone and attacks New York or attacks some infrastructure? To me, the Internet of Things means that more and more of our data is going to be exposed. The ability to not hack your wine list, but more importantly, the ability to hack your home security system.
Right.
So, I mean, as you went around, you talked to a lot of people. Did you get a sense of, and I know you talked to a lot of different companies to come up with this list, did you get a sense of where people think, what's the next movement around security? Is it more national? Is it?
Well, the general sense I get when I talk to people, whether they're technology solution providers or with end user organizations, is that when it comes to security, that they recognize we need a new, better, different approach to it than what we have had in the past, and that it's increasingly important. And now, as you and I briefly discussed earlier this morning, the fact that the CEO of a Fortune 50 corporation loses his job as a result of a security breach, quite frankly, the attitude among many senior executives of large corporations historically has been, whether it's security or any number of other issues, I've got underlings in the company to take advantage of that. It's only money. So we have to pay $90 million, that's actually a good chunk for Global Payment, but for a company the size of Target or a Walmart or something like that, that's a little slap on the wrist. They don't care. It's just a cost of doing business. Now all of a sudden, when you have a drop of 40% in seasonal revenues and the CEO loses his job as a result, now people start looking around and become more aware of that. What they don't yet understand is what are the options, what are the tools, how do we do it? And I think that's a combination of continuing to develop and deploy the technologies like Safely Locks, and others that are trying to do similar kinds of things or analogous things in various aspects of technology, and educating the market about it. Charles, is that right? Charlie.
You mentioned the first grader, and in 20 years or so they're going to be here at Georgia Tech. I've been involved in the digital economy effort here with the Georgia Technology Authority, trying to define what the technology level is in Georgia. One of the things that's coming out of that is the digital divide. The idea that there's a lot of young people, first graders, who have access to the iPads, to the latest technologies. Their schools are teaching and embracing the latest technologies. But when you move out from certain metro areas, you find that this digital divide exists where there's schools that don't even allow these items in their classrooms. Their teachers are not capable of teaching these things. Where do you see the educational future of this going to try to eliminate the digital divide that clearly exists here in Georgia, much less in other parts of the country?
Well, I think one of the challenges is that there's a lot of people that have said, and I happen to agree with them, that we're quickly going to get to a position where access to the internet is a right, not a privilege only for those with the economic value of it. We're also seeing education itself shifting in how it's being delivered as we're moving toward online education, MOOCs as they're sometimes referred to, in terms of the delivery capability, which means we separate the physical presence from the teachers that can still do one-on-one interaction. It's just not face-to-face, it's face-to-face through an interface. And so I think those are all changes that are going to have important indications for us. I read an interesting quote the other day by Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's the famous physicist who is doing the New Cosmos series on, and he said, he was talking about science, but I think it's very analogous to what you're talking about in terms of access to technology, the internet, education, and so forth. He said the problem with science is not our kids not knowing science. The problem is the adults who don't know science passing rules, regulations, constraints, and budgets that don't allow for the kids to grow up learning science, technology, engineering, math, and so forth. And that is a tougher challenge, because by the time somebody gets to be an adult, they either don't know what they don't know, or worse, they don't care what they don't know. And we have to have systems and processes that can work around those people. I mean, if somebody wants to say willfully ignorant, that's a prerogative they ought to be able to pursue. But they should not impose their willful ignorance on others, and we need to come up with systems and processes. And I don't just mean technologies, I mean in the broader sense of how our society and our economy and our governmental organizations and jurisdictions work around that. And again, I'd love to tell you, here's the easy answer to the question, but it's an excellent question. And, okay, go ahead, yes.
You described distributed autonomous corporations. Can you please elaborate? I still don't understand the car owns itself.
Okay, the car, how does the car own itself? Okay, well, keep in mind now that the Internet of Things can communicate electronically. If it's got an intelligent agent on it, that intelligent agent, just as might be the case in the autonomous supply chain of a corporation that's ultimately owned and managed by people, but they may have an intelligent agent out there that's continually looking for potential new sources of supply, and according to guidelines established by management of the organization, actually negotiating agreements and contracts. Those contracts can then become enforceable through digital mechanisms similar to that of the blockchain, so that you have a clear definition. In other words, you don't have to have a piece of paper signed by a human being and faxed back or scanned and emailed back to the other person in order to have a contract. So far, we've got the ability of intelligent agents to negotiate business contracts, to do business, to have complete, well, anonymous, completely verifiable documentation of those business agreements. Now, if it's a truly intelligent agent operating on its own, why can't it operate autonomously? And the answer is it can. If what you have is a situation where, in other words, you might get a group of people together that says, let's do a Kickstarter fund and raise $100,000, if that's what it costs, to buy one of these autonomous taxis. You know, we'll have 100 people pitching $1,000 a piece, and we'll all make the profits, we'll all be shareholders in it, and that may be how it works.
So they would own the car?
They would.
Okay.
But somebody else might say, let's take a different approach. Let's have 100 people pitching $1,000 a piece, and we'll guarantee them, but at the end of 2 years, we're going to pay them back $1,500. And they find 100 people who say, well, if I'm guaranteed that kind of return, I think that's a good return on my investment. I'm glad to get paid back and bought out, essentially. And once everybody's been paid back, the car now operates on its own as a distributed autonomous corporation, according to the guidelines that were set up for it to operate. What's the market I'm supposed to serve? What are the guidelines? At what point do I decide if I'm not making money, I have to go park myself in the garage for a while? Okay? Because the economy slowed down. Or I'm doing so well, I'm the car, I'm going to buy another car and expand. Start opening franchises. I mean, again, it's a radical concept, but, you know, 20 years, pardon?
When do you go to Bermuda?
You know, 20 years ago, I remember speaking about emerging technologies to a group of executives, and I had somebody in the room who was fairly technically knowledgeable. I think in those days we didn't call him CIOs, he was the Vice President of Data Processing, I think was his title. And he explained to me in great detail how and why we would never have the bandwidth or security or willingness of people to do online banking. Well, never say never. You know, if it's economically viable, economics has a tendency to trump technology. If it's economically viable, the technical experts will figure out a way to make it happen. Christian, you had a question or a comment.
One real quick one, a comment please on bringing the internet to the people. Facebook's put out an idea about putting these balloons out to broadcast the internet to Africa and impoverished areas. I'd like you to comment on that. But also, tying back the last question, the first question, what did you think of Stephen Hawking's question or comment this week, where he said success in AI would be the biggest event in human history, but unfortunately, it might almost also be the last.
I hadn't heard that specific comment, but I'm not surprised. You know, let me come back to the AI comment and remind me if I don't address it, because I think this point of reaching out to people. Now, Google is also talking about doing something with putting balloons up, basically weather balloons with transponders that can, yeah, and where they can have enough control over their positioning that they can make the internet accessible wirelessly around the world. You know, I mean, I think whether or not the balloons are the right technical solution to do that, you know, I think it's a wonderful thing. I mean, it's a very scary and disappointing idea to think that the smartest person in the world right now might be planting a rice paddy in China or walking behind a plow in the south of India somewhere. You know, the next Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg or you know, pick a name, Bill Gates, what have you, might be smart enough and motivated enough, but not have access to the information, the systems, the support systems of people, the technologies. And Bill Gates has said, in fact, that he believes by the year 2035, there will be no more poor countries. He's not saying that there won't be poverty anymore, but he said that we will see the same thing even in the poorest countries, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, that we will see the improvements in the economy analogous to what we've seen in India and China over the last couple of decades. You know, I can't imagine we're always going to have relative degrees of poverty, but in general, the quality of life of people is going to improve, and something like these efforts to give people broad-based, low-cost, if not free access to the internet and all the information and access to systems and processes that represents is going to be extremely powerful. Now, to come back to your question about AI, you know, I struggled for a while. I have been very heavily involved with AI for more than a decade, and it's something I had been watching for a couple of decades prior to that, back to the mid-'80s. And I used to describe the fifth wave, as I now call it, intelligent systems, as not only being the next major wave of technology, and absolutely, as with all of the others, okay? I think we can all agree that the internet and the World Wide Web have had an exponentially greater impact on our society and our global economy than all of those predecessor waves of technology did. AI is also going to have an equally bigger impact. But then after a while, I realized, no, that doesn't make it clear enough. AI is much bigger than that. It's the biggest thing since the deployment of the electrical grid, because we could never have had any of this computing or electrical or information technologies if we hadn't had readily available electricity around the world. And then I realized it said, no, that falls short. It's really a bigger change than anything that we've seen since the advent of the Industrial Revolution 200 some years ago now. And I finally came to the conclusion that that probably falls short too. And the best analogy I can think is this is probably the biggest thing that has hit the human race since the advent of agriculture and the rise of civilization as we know it. I think it's that big a transformational change. And getting back to Marty's question initially, with powerful technologies come great hope and great opportunity, and also, you know, very powerful threats. So it's going to be a race to just see if the good people and the good entities out there can take advantage of these technologies in ways that improve the quality of life for people, at the same time that they limit the ability of people or other organizations or entities to use these technologies in ways that are deleterious for us in the long run. And again, it's not a simple answer. It's something we have to just keep looking at, talking about, because the technologies are going to keep moving ahead. People are going to keep using them. Do we have any more questions before we wrap up? Yes, sir, Troy.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Very interesting, very useful. What's a futurist? What does that mean? Are you a chief futurist officer?
Some organizations do have chief futurist officers. And there's a lot going on with the concept of futurism. It is actually becoming a much more highly structured discipline in terms of how to look at it. Over at Georgia Tech Research Institute, I didn't have time to work this into my talk, but a fellow who just had to walk out the door, Tom McDermott, is heading up an effort to develop a horizon scanning system that, looking at future horizons of emerging trends and technologies, combined with a platform that leverages everything from expert opinions to monitoring of various different trends to try to provide ways to project and analyze and compare alternative future scenarios and what they might mean and what it's going to take to trigger these things. And in many cases, it may be relatively small tipping points. If you've ever read Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, he talks about how just certain little things can shift things over. My job, as I look at it as a futurist, is to work with technology solution providers to help them understand how the emerging technologies that they offer can help to address needs in the marketplace and to help them communicate to the marketplace what it is that those technologies do and why they're important, and help people understand why they need to take advantage of emerging technologies like trustless encryption, like augmented reality, like intelligent agent technologies, and the many others that I talked about today. I also do a lot of work with end user organizations, most commonly groups like trade associations and so forth, just again to try to educate people. So I get invited to the XYZ Manufacturers Association's annual conference to talk about emerging technologies and scare the hell out of them, but hopefully get a few of them to think about what these issues are and to think beyond just next quarter's results, to start planning for them effectively. I've been doing this for 30 years, although it took me the first 15 to figure out what the heck it was I was actually doing, and that there was a name out there for this kind of a profession, and it's something that I enjoy very much. Yes, sure, Patrick.
You didn't talk about 3D printing today, so two questions. One, where do you see the leaders? I mean, is it leadership in terms of where are the top manufacturers? Where is the technology coming from? Is it Germany? Is it here? Where? And number two, how do you see it fitting into today's conversation?
And I did not leave 3D printing out either because it's not important. I left it out mainly for two reasons. One, while I have looked a fair amount into 3D printing, I haven't had the opportunity to look as deeply into that as I have in some of these other technologies, and therefore I'm not really comfortable speculating as to who the leaders in the market might be. Secondly, while there are some people in Atlanta doing 3D printing related stuff, I didn't find it as readily as I found some of these others, and we had a limited amount of time. I will say that from a broader application perspective, one of the things that is interesting to me is we're already developing 3D printing, has already moved past just plastics into both metals and living cells. And so those have got huge implications for such things as growing replacement body parts for us, also making much more structurally sound objects and devices, I mean, anything from buildings to vehicles and so forth. And it's got some very intriguing possibilities for the concept of the supply chain. Because if we can take and especially as we move 3D printing and it intersects down the road in another 10 or 15 years with nanotechnology, where we can extract the raw materials from the air and ground right around us that we need for most of what we need to build, and then have 3D printers that can leverage nanotechnology capabilities to make almost anything. The critical component is going to be what's the creative design around it. This is where people are going to add value. People are going to be able to come up with creative ideas. I still haven't seen an intelligent agent that come up with creative new approaches to problem solving. They do a great job of monitoring and managing according to a set of guidelines and goals and objectives they've been getting, but they don't particularly do well yet at thinking outside of the box. Notice I said yet, and I don't know when that's coming. So we're going to have a lot of, very, very exciting opportunities. And I thought about getting into that and seeing if I could find another Star Trek clip of the Star Trek replicator. Well, we had a limited amount of time. But the exciting thing to me is that a lot of this stuff is going to be happening over the course of the next generation. And I plan to take advantage of these health technologies to make sure I'm here to enjoy it. Charlie?
That you mentioned that Georgia Tech and MIT held a joint 3D conference here about a month ago. And the interesting thing that came out of that was a lot of discussion about the fact that it takes only a matter of minutes to create something, but it's still taking the government up to 5 years to certify that it's in compliance with rules and regulations. So what was the point in creating it in 2 minutes if you don't have a government that can't?
Yep, and that gets back to looking at the broader issues of government. How do they work? So there's a lot of ideas about that. Well, look, you've got my contact information there. If I can be of help to any of you, anytime, please don't hesitate to reach out, and I'd be happy to chat with you, meet with you, and thank you very much for your time and attention. I enjoyed it a lot.